Jason or myself with your name and license number, or put it in the chat box. And we have been approved for 1 hour credit for private and 1 hour credit for category 26 on a commercial license. So just keep that in mind, and we'll get it taken care of for you. Moving on, today's speakers are going to include myself, Jason Mallard, the Screven County agent, and Stephen Patrick, the Habersham County, and they'll introduce themselves as we go and get to their parts. So to start with, the first thing you need to know about pond management in Georgia is there are a lot of ponds that have problems. Most of the ponds and lakes in the southeast are man-made structures, and many of these impoundments were constructed for sediment control, irrigation, or livestock watering. The focus was not on fishing, so naturally we have some issues now, and most of them need renovation to keep up with it. So some misconceptions with ponds when it comes to every pond being spring fed. 99% of ponds are, but that can be kind of misleading. Even a pond is fed by spring, it can be highly affected by rainfall levels. The amount of water flowing through a pond is most often tied to the number of watershed acres actually feeding it. Fish production, in turn, is directly tied to productivity in the watershed, and some ponds are naturally more productive than others. Every pond has its limits, and thus care needs to be taken to prevent water quality problems, not correct them. It's easier to prevent a problem than actually to fix it. The last point here about ponds not requiring annual or periodic restocking. Typically, when you get a pond, their first stocking is with bass and bluegill initially. Once that occurs, there's no need to restock again. Stephen will talk more about fish stocking later on in the presentation, along with population management. So I just wanted to touch on it just briefly here. We wanted to share some stuff about actually engineering behind ponds, and you can find a lot of this information on the NRCS's website, and Pond Dam Piping is a good place also for this information. And as we go, if y'all want those links, we can send those out to you as well. These are some more graphics from it, again, from the NRCS. And then we get to spillways. So emergency spillways must be kept clear of obstructions to protect your investment. An emergency spillway should be accounted for when you design a pond. This spillway protects your investment. It is critical that it be kept clear and ready to function when needed. It should not be in use most of the time throughout the year, only during big storms. There's some really good information on spillways through Missouri's Extension Service. I've got a few publications that I found, resources. So if y'all are interested in those, I can share with you with those as well. They're fantastic on different structures and schematics on how to design and build those as well. So going into the fertilizer a little bit more, we're going to start by talking about Dr. Claude Boyd. He developed methods for fertilizing and liming ponds in the 70s and 80s. He was at Auburn University with them, and he actually laid the groundwork for liming and fertilization in the southeastern ponds that we know today. So when it comes to water quality and liming, the first thing you'll want to do as a recreational pond owner is to check your water for total hardness or total alkalinity. In most ponds in Georgia, without liming, the hardness will be too low. The extension currently recommends about that your total hardness be over 20 parts per million. Achieve this hardness through liming the pond with bulk agricultural lime. Make sure to cover the entire pond bottom evenly and thoroughly. And if you don't have the equipment, there are several pond consultants that provide this service. If you go to UGA's aquaculture website or page, there's a list of pond consultants in alphabetical order, and you can actually find one that's nearest to you that you can reach out to and maybe could help you out with that. So the reason we use total hardness or alkalinity as an indicator for water quality is due to its influence on other parameters. Most folks like to gauge things based on pH or oxygen levels, but they fluctuate throughout the course of the day. They are tied to the dial cycle and photosynthesis. It is important to realize a water sample is a snapshot of what could be going on in a pond. Assessing a pond takes looking at all facets of the water quality and fish population, not just the one parameter. So you can see this next picture right here is actually one I want to include. It's what a water sample or water analysis report would look like coming through UGA or one of our labs. And it's for fish pond. And I did this sample back in December. And the first thing I got the call from the client was, hey, my pH is wrong. So typically what I get is people will read this and they see the pH, but they don't read that second line with the calculated hardness. So when we talk about hardness, that's something that you want to keep in mind. And theirs was extremely low, and their pH was extremely out of whack. So it was a very unique, occurrence. But I just wanted to point out that that's where you'll see pH, and then you'll see your calculated hardness on that as well. So once you've got your pond limed, you want to consider if fertilization is actually right for you. First thing to keep in mind is that fertilization creates more fish, not bigger fish. Basically, what you're doing is increasing the carrying capacity of the pond from roughly 100 pounds per acre to about 400 pounds per acre. It is important for you to realize that fertilized ponds are actually green, so you're not wanting something that's clear. They're going to be green. Don't fertilize if you already have a green pond, is a rule of thumb. Ponds that are muddy or weedy have existing dense plankton blooms and have fish populations that are out of balance or have excess water flow that should not be fertilized. So kind of keep that in mind. So proper fertilization, you want 5 to 10 applications per year using a Secchi disc for 12 to 18-inch visibility. The number of applications varies greatly as every pond has its own natural level of productivity. Also be aware that some ponds are difficult to fertilize due to excessive water flow. Fertilizer is a great tool to enhance your pond if it's used correctly. Inconsistent fertilization is worse than never fertilizing at all due to the way it affects the forage base for your bass. You can use liquid fertilizer or you can find granular. Granular is probably going to be the most common and a little bit more on the less expensive side. Granular fertilizers are small pellets and are the easiest to find, like I said. They must be kept off the bottom mud until the pellets actually dissolve. So there's a few ways you can approach it to do that. One is you can put it on a platform. Some people will take plywood and send it out there and have it float on it and let the granulars kind of sit on that and dissolve from the top all the way down the bottom, so it's not getting to that mud before it dissolves. Or another trick is to cut an X in the bag, the fertilizer bag, and carefully sink it into shallow water and let it run out and dissolve. The problem is with that, you'll have to actually go back and retrieve the bag. So if you're not wanting to clean that up, that method might not be for you, but it's one that you can use. Another key thing here to kind of point out is improper fertilization is the #1 cause of most problems in ponds that we see. Fertilizer is not always the answer to your issue. The Secchi disc, like I mentioned in the previous slide, is something that's a tool that's used to kind of gauge whether you should fertilize or not. I think it's really nifty. Looking at this picture, you can see one in the water, and this little chart down at the bottom tells you what basically a recommended management rate for it is. You can use a pie pan too is another way. What you're looking for is the depth at which the object disappears is what you're looking for. Too much visibility means you need fertilizer, and if you can't see it, you probably have too dense of a bloom. So when we talk about aeration, a lot of people will ask, or when I go out to ponds or things like that, a lot of people will ask me, should we aerate the pond? Aeration is a common question. Is it necessary? No is 99.9% of the time is the answer for regular homeowners or fish pond owners. Commercial production, yes. Some folks like the fountain for the aesthetic purposes, but overall aeration is a tool for commercial producers that is often used incorrectly in homeowner ponds, and it's really costly. If you do have an aerator, make sure to use it at the best times from sun up or sundown to sun up, not during the day. Oxygen at its lowest point early in the morning, and so that's why we kind of say sun down to sun up. The aerator is most helpful when used at night, not during the daytime. There are some situations where money is not a problem, and you'll see folks use aeration to break up the thermocline in the summer. So I put this picture on here, speaking of thermocline, to kind of visualize. You'll see a lot of times if you're an avid fisherman, you'll probably go look for stuff on thermocline. You'll see it come up in blogs and all this other stuff a lot. Just keep in mind that when we talk about a pond, the thermocline layer is very thin a lot of times. So you got to keep that in mind. So as we're going, just kind of visualize that, because it's not going to be a big area like in some of the bigger lakes or things like that. So just kind of see that visual. To me, this can lead to a lot of problems in the event of a power failure if you have an aerator, or eliminating emergency options when you push the pond too hard. Once you exceed carrying capacity, bad things typically ensue. So the best time to use an aerator is only for emergencies. So then we're going to talk a little bit about pond dyes, just briefly. Pond dyes like Aquashade or Dion are easy products to apply. You see it a lot of times. People want their pond to look a certain way, so sometimes they turn to pond dyes as the solution. One thing you have to remember is that dye replaces your phytoplankton. The water may look attractive while it's blue, but you've basically limited your productivity and limited a big producer of oxygen for your pond. Thus, you're left in a situation where summer fish kills are probably a good possibility. So you got to be very, very careful using them. All right, now I'm gonna hand it over to Jason and let him tell y'all a little bit about weed management. So let me give Jason the controls. All right, Jason, you should be able to mess with the screen now.
Okay. All right. First off, we do thank everyone for taking time and joining us today for this webinar. We appreciate your interest in what we're trying to do. We'll get started now. Again, please contact, as Blake has mentioned before, please contact us with request for, Blake, I'm having a little bit of lag time in controlling those slides. If you will you put it back up one slide for me, please? And I may just let you change the slides.
Here, hold on 1 second. Let me see. This right here?
Go back up one more. Just go back to the beginning. Okay, there, that'll work.
That one? Okay.
Okay. All right. First off, when we start thinking about weeds, what are plant needs? When we get to thinking about that, we think that
I was trying to do.
First off,
I don't know.
When you unplug it, you can still hear the man talking.
okay. If everybody will, please mute your microphones. When we start looking at plants, what are plant needs? We need sunlight for plants. We need nutrients and, of course, water. In this circumstance, we cannot control the water. Of course, we're in a pond. But what we can start thinking about is controlling the sunlight and the needs of the plant through the sunlight and so forth. As far as if you're already on a fertilizer program, well, of course, we want to continue on that fertilizer program. But if you've not started a fertilizer program yet, let's first off start and take care of the weeds, get those out of the way, and then we'll start with a fertility program if that's needed. As far as controlling the sunlight, yes, of course, we cannot control when the sun shines and so forth, that kind of thing. But what we can do is start to control those algal blooms like Blake was talking about through using the Secchi disc and that kind of thing. As we start to, once we get control of the weeds, then once we start to get color within the water, we'll start to shade out those lower depths and get rid of some of those weeds that are in the lower portions of the pond. So, of course, one thing that we're always going to have trouble with around the edges. Blake, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Around the edges, we're always going to end up dealing with shallow water. We'll consistently have problems around these edges with controlling weeds, and this is just a given. So just keep that in mind, that we'll need to constantly keep tabs on what's going on around the edges, because if we have these shallow depths, there's no way we're going to shade out any weeds with that going on. So one of the options there are, if you want to renovate the pond, if you want to dig these edges out, I do urge you to be sure that you go through and go through the proper permitting process, take care of all that as you need to. There's a good publication that I would like to tell you about. It's called Building or Renovating a Pond in Georgia. Again, Building or Renovating a Pond in Georgia. It's a guide for citizens. It goes through all the proper steps of permitting and that kind of thing, and things for you to consider. All right, next slide. As far as controlling the weeds, first off, we need to identify the weed we're working with. There are many weeds that are very similar, so it can get kind of touchy. We're trying to identify some of them. Blake and I are here in Screven in Effingham County. We're here to help you with that kind of situation. But identifying what we're dealing with, taking into account the number of acres that we're trying to work with. We need to take all these things into consideration when we start building a plan to get rid of the weeds, dealing with the problems that we're working with. So some things to consider: the total acres in the pond, the depth of the water. Some chemicals are going to give you recommendations on surface area, whilst others are going to give you a more based on water volume, depth of the pond, and acreage, and so forth. Also, some other things to keep in mind are our ponds flushing out on a regular basis? Are we dealing with a lot of water flow coming through, that kind of thing? We want to keep that in mind for several reasons. One being, what's going to happen downstream? Is the chemicals that we're putting in our pond going to go down to a neighbor's pond and affect the irrigation that they may be pumping onto a crop? We could end up with problems from that. So we want to just kind of assess the overall situation. If you have someone that is advising you, you want to be sure you bring those points up to them. If there's livestock that are drinking out of the pond, if there's irrigation downstream, or even irrigation out of this pond, that's just things we want to keep in mind. Timing is critical. We don't want to wait. It's a good time in the spring of the year to start application of herbicides so that we can get control of these weeds when they're starting to grow, before they get a lot of bulk to try to deal with. So if we catch them early before they get big, that kind of thing, early morning's a good time to apply the chemicals. But having a good planning process and having the proper timing is important. Next slide, please. Another thought to take into consideration would be triploid grass carp. We can these, as I just mentioned, when we start thinking about bulk of how much weed problem do we have, when you start thinking about a fish this size, 12 to 24 inches in length, if we have 5 to 10 tons per acre of weeds in our pond, well, these few little fish are not going to be able to take care of it. We need to get control of the weeds, and then these grass carp can be a benefit to us in maintaining. We look at the rates that we have at the bottom of the screen here: 5 per acre on preventative, and then go on up to 10 to 20 per acre for corrective. But still take into consideration how much bulk you have. How much are you expecting these fish to be able to take care of? They're not going to take care of a 10 to 15 ton per acre problem. So, but they do work in maintaining. Once we come in and get control of the pond, get the weeds under control, then these grass carp can be very beneficial in maintaining our status that we would like to have. They this 12 to 24 inch length, that's when we're going to get the most impact out of them. As they age, their metabolism slows. We're looking at about 7 years of productivity from a grass carp. Next slide, please. Feeding preference, I've got these ranked here from high to moderate to low. Just as with us, when we go to a, I mean, being funny, but think about a buffet dinner. When we go, we're going to pick out what we want to eat first. Well, it's going to be the same thing with these grass carp. They're going to pick and choose what they eat. It may not be what you actually put them in there to take care of, but if there's something around the edge or something in the middle that they'd rather have, that's what they're going to go to first. And that's the way they're ranked here. So these that are ranked high on this, these would be the ones that they're going to go to first. So if you've got these problems, well, that's going to bring grass carp up on the rankings of your methods of handling problems in your pond. Next slide, please. Chemical weed control. All right. I put the picture in the top right, not intentionally to scare you, but to make you think. We need to read the labels of the chemicals that we're putting out. We need to be sure we're following directions. These chemicals, if they're applied correctly, are not toxic to the fish. But if we go way off label, if we don't follow the directions, we can create problems. A lot of times when we see fish kills, it's because of not following the directions, maybe applying too much at one point in time, going out trying to treat too much of the pond. Many of your labels are going to tell you to treat 1/4 of the pond or 1/3 of the pond, wait 10 days, 14 days, and then come back and make another application. We don't need to overtreat. What happens with that is when we come in and spray this a whole lot of this pond, we end up killing a lot of vegetation, and then we've got to as that material begins to rot, we're going to take the oxygen out of the water, and therefore the fish can suffocate. That's many times where the problem comes from with fish kills. So just make sure you follow the label and make sure you pick the right chemical for what you're trying to do. Let's see, another thing to bring up is as far as toxicity, copper is very good for taking care of algae. If you look at the picture on the bottom right, that is filamentous algae. It's got the consistency of like wet cotton. When you pick it up, it's just kind of slimy and gooey and wet and that kind of thing. But copper is excellent at taking care of it. If you apply it to a pond where the water hardness is not where it needs to be, you can have a problem with that. So we want to be sure that we follow the label. If the label tells us to check water hardness, or if it tells us to do other things, be sure we follow what we need to do. As far as chemicals, we want to be sure we're picking chemicals that have an aquatic label. That we're able to, we want to be sure we're doing that, so that, because that label is the law. It is federal law to follow those labels, and we want to be sure that we are applying something that's labeled for putting in ponds, lakes, and so forth. The label will tell us about the active ingredient, what ingredient it is that does the work within the chemical. Different chemicals are going to give us different impacts. It may be immediate, or it may be something that's systemic, which takes a little more time, and so forth. But we want to be sure that we're not that we follow the label and do what we need to do. As far as modes of action, we have, going back to the classifications of chemicals, there are many different classifications, but two of them I want to hit on today would be systemic and a contact herbicide. Systemic is going to be, when we think of Roundup, we think that is a systemic chemical. It enters in through the leaf, goes down into the plant, and kills the plant from the root up. That's the way it works. So systemic chemicals take a little bit longer, but anyway, like glyphosate, it is a systemic herbicide. And then the next one we'll talk about will be contact herbicides. Contact herbicides, they act a lot quicker and they kill what they contact. So if you don't get good coverage, then that's going to be the determining factor of how good of action you get from that chemical. Diquat is one that we use a good bit from that, but that would be contact herbicides, diquat. As far as choosing a pond consultant, we do have a list through the University of Pond Consultants. We do urge you to check into them, make sure they're qualified, make sure they're bonded and insured like they need to be, and you may want to get references and so forth. Some of this we can apply and take care of these problems ourselves. That's That's something we can do. But if you feel overwhelmed trying to work with it or having trouble with the chemicals and so forth, it may be something to check into getting a pond consultant to help you with what you're trying to do. As far as long-term control, step number one would be prevention. Are we having, do we have water hardness issues? Being sure that certain weeds that I'm going to get into in a few minutes, they're even more easily controlled if the water alkalinity and hardness is to where it needs to be. So, from some preventative steps may help us a long way with that. One thing being, what's coming into our pond? Is it being fed from other ponds upstream? Do we have a neighbor who's infested with a weed and then that weed is being, coming down to us? That could be something to check into. Are we overstocking our pond? Are we overfeeding in our pond? Therefore, when we bring in feed and dump, are feeding our fish, we're bringing in a lot of nutrients into our ponds. So are we overdoing that? That's some things to consider. But most of the time when we have weed issues, there could be underlying problems that are adding to that. This is some photographs of algae, Filamentous algae. That's the one in the bottom right I was telling you about earlier. This weed, when you pick it up, it will feel cottony, wet, like wet cotton, something like that, kind of slimy feeling and so forth. Your copper products are going to be on the good side of trying to take care of this weed. But keep in mind, I want to remind you again about checking before you add a copper product to a pond. It's good to check the alkalinity, check the hardness of the water, and be sure you're in line with that before you apply it. And if you follow the directions, the copper-based products are very good at taking care of this weed. And one more thing to mention, following directions, like it mentions at the bottom left there about treating 1/3 of the pond, wait 7 to 10 days or 10 to 14 days before we treat another third or quarter of the pond. We want to be sure we're following those directions. Spike rush. This is another weed that I find very common when I'm asked to go out and visit ponds. We see this quite regularly around with pond visits. One thing to note on it, as mentioned in the middle, there is a big problem when the hardness or alkalinity are off on the pond. So therefore, we go back to kind of the way we have this laid out with the presentations today. We want to go in and check our pond, run a water test, see how it's doing, if the pond water is in good shape and so forth, and then we move into a weed control program. As far as we may need to lime, and a lot of times with this weed, if we add our agricultural lime to it, that can help us when we start trying to take care of this weed. So getting the proper order is very important. Reward is good at helping to control spike rush. Smart weed, we see it a good bit around the edges of the pond. We have listed here the chemicals that'll help us with taking care of it. Southern Naiad, this is another one that that we see a good bit around in this area. Our diquat plus copper is a good combination, and you see the others there that are listed. So. Duckweed and watermeal, both of these can be very much a headache to pond owners. We see on the bottom right there a picture of duckweed. Looking at a pond from a distance, it's kind of tough to tell the difference between duckweed and watermeal. But if you'll notice here, generally what helps me to remember is when we think of a duck in a pond, he's got his feet below him. Well, that's just the way this plant is with the roots coming out the bottom. We'll see it there. But that's as far as identifying duckweed, that's a good picture of it with the stems, the roots coming out the bottom. Diquat is good with taking care of it. As far as watermeal, it can get expensive with some of these weeds to take care of. What you see here, the excellent option for watermeal is $160 an acre for clipper with meoxicin. Next. All right, white water lily, another one that can produce some pretty flowers, but they're also a lot of trouble to try to get rid of sometimes. So there's the chemical control options for you at 2,4-D, triclopyr, and fluoridine. Cattails, we see those often around the edge of the pond. Our glyphosate products are very good on those. Clear cast, those type of products. Next. As far as identifying plants, again, as county agents, we're here to help you and encourage you to bring us samples if you need help trying to get identification. But there are also online resources. This is one through Texas A&M University. It's called Aquaplant, and they do give help you with trying to identify your weeds and also give weed management advice. But as extension agents, we're here to help you, and that's what we're here for. So if we can help you at any point in time, please let us know. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Steven at this point.
Let's see if we can get these slides to move.
Yeah, let me.
Blake's gonna have to move them, or
There you go. Try it right now, Steve. See if it works.
No, well, or was that you or me?
That's you.
Okay, good. We'll go back just a sec. All right. Well, talking about, you know, the fish in the pond, I always like to cover this stretch because a lot of times, like he said earlier, feeding the fish, stocking the fish, a lot of that has to do with your water quality and the problems that you have. I'd say 9 out of every 10 fish kill calls that I go on come from somebody overstocking or trying too hard, feeding too much, and just, they have the greatest of intentions, but they end up shooting themselves in the foot. So first slide here, you know, when you get into feeding fish, you know, once the water temp's over 50 degrees, the fish will accept feed. We tend to recommend floating feed. That way you can monitor that the fish are actually eating it. And generally you're looking to gauge about 2% of the body weight at most. And you want to make sure whatever you're feeding, they eat it right away. You don't want to have it floating around, deteriorating, breaking down and messing up your water quality. You want to make sure they eat all the food. And, you know, like we said, in Georgia, the way the weather goes back and forth, it is good to feed during the winter times just to give those fish something, especially being farther south for y'all. It's probably warm enough during the winter to keep those fish active because their metabolism is going once that water temp gets over 50. I think we talked a lot about turnover and oxygen depletion earlier with Blake, but you know, like he said, that thermocline in a pond is so small that you typically don't see folks fishing it like you do reservoirs. And your goal is to maintain water quality where you're not going to have that. So we've talked about that already. The biggest thing when you think about stocking is go back to the history of why we have what we have. You know, the foundation of all pond management in southeastern fisheries goes back to Dr. Homer Swingle at Auburn. He was an extension entomologist who was focused on solving two problems. That's mosquito control and food for the family farm. And what that tells you right away is that if he's doing this during the Depression days, he needed a combination of fishes that were going to take care of themselves, and that you were supposed to catch and harvest and eat fish, which nowadays everybody likes to throw everything back. And that's where they kind of hurt themselves. It's good to harvest fish from ponds because that's the way these stocking rates were intended. So what Swingle wanted, like we said, is satisfactory fishing, meaning anytime you go down to the pond, you should be able to catch something because you're starving during the Depression. It's not like today where we're just doing it for fun. You know, he wanted a variety of species so they could, you know, have some diversity, a variety of sizes so you wouldn't catch all the fish all at once and eat them all, and something sustainable where Blake said at the start, you don't need to restock that pond over and over and over again. You're just wasting your money. This guy right here taught everybody to catch and release, throw everything back, and that works great for reservoirs. It's wonderful for the river where I like to fish, but in a small pond, even though, you know, I got a lake that I help manage here locally that's 125 acres, it's still stunted out bass heavy because they listen to that catch and release ethic and pretty much results in a stunted out bass population everywhere you go. And that's where people like to catch things like this guy. You know, this fish is actually coming out of a pond where you don't get a bite every day because the pond's full of adult gizzard shad and the bass that can eat them are doing well, but it's very hard to get a bite. What you're going to focus on is how to produce fish through managing that population appropriately And most anglers are looking for larger bass these days, and it's for sport, not for harvest, like we keep saying. So you still have to harvest even if you want to catch big trophy bass. And that comes with a question of how do you do that? You're constantly keeping out certain types of fish, because if those bass get overpopulated, there's no food left available because you have too many mouths to feed. You want to have a bluegill population that has a lot of 3 to 5 and a lot of 4 to 6 inch bass or bluegill, just to maintain a quality bass population. And that's meaning where you go out and catch 1 to 3 to maybe 5 pound bass, a good variety of sizes. It's not even saying that that's a trophy situation. That's just a normal balanced pond situation. Those bass need those quality forage items to survive and sustain themselves. When you go to Electrofish, you can see there, you'll catch a lot of small bass. And then you look on the bottom slide, where are those 3 to 5, 4 to 6 inch bluegill? There's a few 6 inch bluegill, but most of the pond is bass that are 12.5 inches or under. So what bass can eat a 6 inch bluegill? You know, he'd have to be 16, 18 inches to choke down a 6 inch bluegill. So you got a situation where you got a whole lot of predators and a whole lot of prey that can't fit in their mouth. So gotta make sure to harvest appropriately. Getting into stocking the pond, everybody here probably doesn't. Some of you guys might even want to go bass fishing. So you got to decide, what do you want and what are you managing for? Do you like to eat fish? Do you like to have friends over? Are you just going after that big trophy catch? That's where you got to dig into this data and figure out exactly what you want to manage your pond the way you want. When you're looking at stocking, Swingle recommended 50 bass per acre. And if you're going for trophy bass, a lot of consultants now will dumb that down to 25 or even 35 per acre at the most, because they don't want that many predators in the system. If you stock at 50 per acre and don't harvest any bass, they'll stun out very quickly. So you're still talking about, you need to harvest those small bass to get where you need to go, just to stay balanced. See, a lot of consultants advising folks to stock 100, 500, 1,000, 100 a year. Go get Florida bass genetics, you know, get some F1 hybrids and stock 100 every spring to improve your genetics. And it's like, no, they're just selling you fish. If you've got what you need, somebody's selling you something, you really need to check their intentions and decide, are they really trying to help you? Or are they really just trying to make money off of you? That comes up just about every spring. Same thing goes with bluegill. You can see 400 to 500 per acre on that initial stocking. Same thing applies if, you know, there's a lake up here we've got that's got a lot of redbreast sunfish coming from a local stream and not very many bluegill. So there's supplemental stocking bluegill trying to establish a population to get better forage. And in this situation, you can see there, once again, 500 per acre. If you want red ear or shell cracker that folks like to catch, you see the number drops just a little bit, but you know, we'll talk a little later. You don't want a pond with just red ear sunfish or shell crackers unless trophy bluegill is your goal, because they're just not a great forage fish for the bass. But you know, bluegill were Swingle standard, the best possible forage fish you can apply. Threadfin shad are an option, you know, for those that want some added variety. You can see, usually you'll hear them talk about loads, 1 to 2 loads per acre, trying to establish a population. They distract those bass away from the smaller fish and allow the bigger bluegill to develop. And in some situations, consultants will then follow up and encourage you to stock gizzard shad or golden shiners. But I would stick away from that until you're really good with this. And you know, maybe we could talk for a while to get you where you can maybe start to use gizzard shad if you've already tried the threadfin. But steer clear initially. Same thing applies with tilapia, especially with y'all on the state line. There's probably a lot of people hearing about stuff going on in South Carolina where tilapia stocking is legal, but it's not legal in Georgia, so we can't do that in our ponds. You get in big trouble with folks if they catch you using those as forage fish. Average striped bass are an opportunity. You know, if you're interested in that, send me an email. You know, they can be stocked as fingerlings and fed trophy trout chow, you know, something like Aquamax feeds, and grown to 6 to 8 pounds pretty easily. Winter trout are something that you could use all the way down to Tifton. Dr. Bertle had some studies where they threw trout about that size in the picture out every fall. and grew them out in the pond, and they were 3 pounds by the end of the season. But if you're into trophy bass, think about a 6 or 8 pound bass eating a 3 pound trout. Right as those trout start to die in the spring when the water warms up, you've got something to fish for and enjoy all winter, and then you've got some Cadillac bass food come springtime. And that's, if you go to looking at trophy bass management, you see all those trout stocking lakes across the Texas, California, out west. All those western lakes are using trout stocking as the real big component of their trophy bass programs, and it's something we can use here if we choose to. Other options, golden shiners, being a little farther south down towards the Florida line, maybe they start to become applicable, but I tend to steer clear. Tilapia, like we said, are illegal. Gizzard shad, you see there in the upper right photo, an adult gizzard shad gets 12 to 14 inches long. If your bass are all 12 to 14 inches, that's the last thing you want to have swimming around in the pond, because it's biomass that can't be used. Crawfish are another option that a lot of folks think about, and I've had a few consultants arguing with me that they use a totally different trophic niche than the bluegill do or the shad do, and maybe they do add to the forage base of the pond, but for me, that's just if you got more money than you know what to do with. Don't feel like you have to use any of these options. Make sure you've got that bluegill thing in place first. If you've got quality bluegill forage established, you really don't need these options. It's just, there's a lot of folks in the state that have more money than they know what to do with, and they'll pay whatever it takes to do everything possible, but you don't have to be that guy. You can get the same results just following the basic principle. Fathead minnows are one that a lot of folks talk about, and you see them do because they're cheap. On the initial stocking, it's a great opportunity to get those bass off to a good start, distract them from the bluegill. But after about the first year or two, those little fatheads don't get more than about 2 inches long, so they'll be completely eliminated. And once your pond's established, if you're throwing them out there, I mean, you might as well just take 2 or 3 rolls of pennies and throw them out. You probably get more benefit from the copper off the pennies than you did throwing fathead minnows, because they're just not going to give you what they were worth. Grass carp, we talked about earlier in the weed control slides. Like he said, they will eat certain weeds, but always remember there's only certain types of weeds they'll control. And if you go back through the slide set, we can send you the PowerPoint. Each of those PowerPoint slides says whether they're effective at control or not. And the picture of this big guy shows you that once they get about 7 years old, their metabolism slows, and they're not going to be very good for you. Tail crackers kind of falling off on the list. You can see here, they're not a great forage fish, but they are good if you like trophy bluegill or pan fishing and eating fish like that. Excellent option if you like that. Stock the bass intentionally heavy at 100 per acre, and then stock your shell cracker at 400 or 500 to the acre, and you'll have some really nice trophy bluegill. It's a lot of fun if you like the cane pole or fly fishing. It's definitely an option for you there. Let's see what else we got. We're about to run out of time and get into questions here, Blake, so we'll try to speed up just a hair. Catfish is one that Swingle assumed you were going to eat those guys when they reached 2 pounds because you were starving. This county agent at a GACA field day showed you that sometimes that doesn't happen. Do realize once they get over about 4 or 5 pounds, they shift over and become the top predator. They can start eating those 8 to 12 inch bass in your stunted out pond where you don't keep anything, and eventually you wind up with 4 or 5 really large catfish that don't want to hit your bait because they're eating bass every time they open their mouth to breathe, and it's really difficult to catch anything. So be careful with the catfish, water quality wise and just predator wise. Few people realize that they're not bottom feeders and scavengers. They can become the top predator in a system, and they are quite prolific at eating bluegill and bass. Redbreast, like we said, they don't spawn, they don't give you good forage, so they're fun to catch, pretty to catch, but not the greatest thing to have. Crappie, same way, they compete with your bass, they tend to overpopulate, they don't provide forage for the bass, they're just competitive species that if you like them, you like them because you're out there hammering them right now and eating every one you catch. And some people can get away with that, but the traditional person calling us throws them back or doesn't fish as much as they claim, and they'll take over the pond in a hurry. And then you just have to drain and restock because there's not much else you can do. Georgia Giants, they're great initially, but their reproduction kicks out green sunfish. And that little guy on the right-hand corner on the bottom is a green sunfish, a trophy one at that. And he doesn't produce forage. He competes with your bass for food. And he's just jamming your system in terms of he's not helping you out. So the folks that sell Georgia Giants and hybrid sunfish, I don't want to disrespect them here, but they're assuming that you want to restock your pond every couple of years. They're assuming that you just want to catch those big Georgia Giants initially, and that you don't care about the damage that they're going to do later. One thing I'll point out is that the record for red ear sunfish and bluegill is about twice the weight and size of a Georgia Giant. So they're really Georgia midweights, because they don't stack up to what the regular bluegill could do. So why put them in there? It's a marketing tool, and I hope you don't fall victim. So putting it all together for a balanced pond, we've got the stocking rates here, giving you some harvest rates, and we'll share these slides where you can see them and write them down a little faster. Trophy bluegill, like we said, just up that bass stocking rate, and don't keep any of them. You'll have trophy bluegill before you know it. Trophy bass, you're limiting those bass fingerlings. You're harvesting bass intensively and trying to make the most of them, with that. What you want to do, Blake? Keep going just for a sec, or do we want to go for some questions? Or
Yeah, you can go for a few more minutes. Yeah.
couple more minutes on this just to put it all back together. Florida strain genetics can help you in terms of overall size at the end of the day. But always remember, harvest manipulation is what makes those bass bigger. It's not that you put the proper genetics, it's that you harvested them appropriately. So don't get sold too much on that. I wouldn't even overspend for that. Personally, I don't spend the money on Florida strain at all. How do you check the pond? Maybe you can talk Blake or Jason into getting out there with a seine. There's a little chart you can read. Blake's laughing like, that's snaky. I ain't doing that. And I've had a few clients that tell me that, it's always fun. Keith Lassiter in Lamar County put me in a pond where I went up over my head, and they all were standing on the bank laughing because they didn't tell me they had dug a big hole for an irrigation something. Really tricked me good. But when you're looking at the Seine Hall, you're looking at reproduction, young of the year. It's something, if you get trained, you can just about walk the edge of your pond bank, and that size distribution of those little bluegill tell you what you're going to catch, and you can evaluate a pond looking at the young of the year very quickly and easily. And that's something that once you know what species they are and what size they are, I can have 4-H kids walk up a pond at a kid's fishing day and be like, oh, dang, Steve, this ain't going to be no good. And you're like, why? And they're like, we're going to catch dinks. And I'm like, yeah, you are, but we're here for catch rates for a kid's fishing day, not for you to catch a trophy bass. So catch your dinkers and hope you get lucky. And, they walk up and see the right type of forage, and they get excited and start tying on the 12-inch worms, and they're on for the day because they think they're going to catch a pig. You can figure out what you have pretty quick looking at the forage. Electrofishing is fun, but you don't need to pay somebody to do that to know what's happening in your pond. You can use a chart like this called relative weight, where just in a quick snapshot, you can look at that chart for bass and see that a 12-inch bass should weigh 9/10 of a pound. When you put your bass on a scale and a measuring board, you can start figuring out, and here's just a couple examples of measuring boards and charts. Let's go to the next one. You can figure out if you're catching 12-inch bass that weigh 3/4 of a pound, which is pretty typical. Look at the chart and say they should weigh 9/10 of a pound. You can figure out pretty quick that your fish are underweight. What that tells you is you need to harvest small bass, get them out of the pond until your relative weight starts climbing. And that's how you manage the population to get the type of fish you want to catch. Now, if you're doing trophy bluegill, you may say 83%, I need to stunt this thing out some more and get it down in the 60s so that I can catch some truly humongous bluegill. It goes both ways with that. This is a bass example. And in that situation, we just told the client, get out there this time of year in the spring, harvest 10 pounds per acre of 10 to 12-inch bass. And you may say, well, that's 20 bass per acre. He got a 5-acre lake. That's 100 bass he needs to go throw on the bank immediately. And then check relative weight this summer and see where he's at, see how they respond, and maybe throw out another 100 this fall and another 100 the next spring. And you keep checking it. until like Laceola over here in Cleveland, their relative weight went from 65 up to about 75, up to 87. And then they're into the 90s now, and they're starting to catch, 3 to 5 pound bass instead of always catching 10 to 12 inchers. Structure is something for you to have fun with. You don't necessarily have to use it. It's just something to give you somewhere to get the fish to key in on if you're going fishing. It's just mainly there for fun. I did put the note to put it above the thermocline because there's no oxygen under that line. So typically close to shallow water, but not shallow enough that it turns into a weed bomb. Algae get all over that stuff if it's too shallow. Spawning areas, I guess my mom and daddy's pond, I added this slide. We had a 50, 60-year-old pond where the bluegill weren't doing so good, and we went and backed a pea gravel truck up right beside the dock and spew out a load of pea gravel on each side of the dock, and all of a sudden the grandkids have a place to catch big trophy bluegill all the time because the pond's bass heavy, and it just made a great opportunity to create easy to cast 2 spawning beds. So that's something that's easy to do, quick to do. We did talk a little bit about if you have the crappie and you need to renovate the pond, get it down to empty, get it to puddles. Don't think you can treat a ½ acre of water, ¼ acre of water. Oh, it's only a foot deep. That's not going to be effective. You want to get it down to where you're treating puddles where really the fish should die without any chemical at all, and the chemical is just to make double sure. We talked a little bit about fish kills. What do y'all want to do? Answer some questions or keep going with some slides? Questions so we don't run out of time on you?
Yeah, we can go ahead and move into questions. Here, I'll take back control real fast. Move it to the last slide here.
I didn't think I had too many more.
So this is our contact information as well. Emails. If y'all have, like I said, the pesticide stuff, those are the emails you can send it to, mine or Jason's. If you have questions too after this, by all means, you can email us as well. But yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. If y'all have any, y'all can either type it in the chat box or y'all can unmute and ask. And if we don't have any, I guess Steve, if you have any final thoughts or any other, we got a few more weeds we can go through if y'all want to take it through those. Or
the biggest thing that we wanted to talk through today is, like Jason said, get out and get your hardness check. Look for those weeds and scout this time of year, because you can't go out in the middle of summer and call Jason or Blake and want them to fix your problem. You need to be proactive and look, and even if it's just a little bit on the edges or corner, take it to them and say, what is this? How do we control it? How do we nip it in the bud before it really gets going? And then you can save yourself some money. And bringing them a sample is critical, because every time I do this, I have guys that have spent $800 or $1,000 or $1,200. They've wasted on the wrong chemical. And Jason or Blake could have saved you money by just getting it properly identified, figuring out what to do, and going from there. And then I wanted to do all the fish stocking stuff, because I can't tell you how many 100 people every year call me and talk through their pond, and they're like, yeah, I'm going up to the farm supply to pick up my fish again this spring. And it's like, how often do you do that? And they're like, I buy them every spring. It makes me feel so good. And I'm like, well, if you like setting money on fire, keep buying them. And we're here to save you time and money. We want you to be efficient with your money. I don't have money to waste. I mean, I don't want to waste time either. So that's why we're hitting those points as hard as we can to try to save you some time, because if you're not following those fundamentals, you're going to end up with a big weed mat, and then you'll treat it with too much chemical and have a fish kill and have trouble. And it doesn't have to be like that. Proactive management is a whole lot more efficient and effective, and cost savings.
Yeah, and another thing to remember is to kind of have blinders on when you're going about looking at your problem. Just because your neighbor had a problem in his pond and they solved it one way doesn't mean that that's going to be the necessary solution for your pond. Just because it worked for them, your pond might be a little bit different in terms of hardness and alkalinity, and some other factors might be different in your pond. So the management strategy might be slightly different. So, you know, if you ever have a question or anything like that, we're here to help you, and that's what, you know, use us as resources, use the resources shared today. Jason, do you have anything to add to it?
I don't really have anything to add. Like it's been said, we're here to help y'all. If you have any questions or need ID on weed ID or for pond water samples, we do that through extension also. So if you want to bring those pond samples to us, we can get those analyzed and get you some results back on that. So, but as extension agents, that's what we're here to do, is to help you when you have problems. So give us a call.
I'll say the slide set should be, well, not this exact one, but one just about similar to it. And we can post up this exact one on our website. I know I've got a similar one on my website, and then there's two other, I think there's a Lincoln County webinar and then a College of Ag webinar that's about an hour and a half, a little bit different presentation, but the same information if you want to go back and review any of those. And I know this one we did record. I think they're going to share it with folks. I did notice it wasn't recording for the first couple slides, so I jumped in right at that Claude Boyd and liming and all that, caught that. So we didn't get the first 2 or 3 slides, but for the most part, I think we've got a recording of this, and maybe that'll help you as a resource as well.
Yeah, I appreciate your catch on that, because we had some technical difficulties with this Zoom stuff. So I appreciate that, Stephen.
About 2 or 3 slides in and said, "Oh Lord, we're not recording."
Yeah, I couldn't see it on my screen more. I know Jason also has a local recording of it as well. He was recording, so we should have gotten the whole presentation. I think he started when I started, so as a backup, we came prepared. So we'll get that out and share that with all y'all. The final few remarks, we plan to send out like a little survey to see how, you know, what we can do to better serve y'all if y'all are a part of this training, kind of see what, you know, did the questions get answered, and if y'all have any other questions. So just look for that in your email in the coming days, and I think we can wrap it up. We appreciate y'all all coming on and joining us. I hope it was beneficial. I hope y'all had some questions that were answered. And our doors and emails and phones are always open and ready for y'all to give us a call or come see us. So please use us, and if there's anything we can do for you, let us know.
Thank you for your participation today.
Thank y'all.